Good day everyone, I'm Sharmaine PAQUIA and together with Angelo, we will be discussing Unit 4, Modules 5 to 7 of PAQUIA's Philosophical Analysis. So for the table of contents of this video, we will tackle Module 5, which will talk about the fallacies, followed by Module 6, which is about the theory of appraisal and the types of arguments, and lastly, Module 7, which is about composing complex arguments. So, ayan, mukha lang siyang konti, pero please bear with us kasi medyo mahaba-haba talaga to. Pero, no worries, we will try our best to keep this discussion as short and as concise as possible. So, let's start with Module 5. We will be tackling 14 fallacies for this video. So, let's start with the first one, which is yung argumentum ad hominem. So, sa fallacy na to, basically, yung person, ina-attack niya yung other person na kausap niya instead na yung argument ng person na yun. So, in simple terms, basically, parang personalan siya, ganun. Nagkaka-personalan. Instead na yung argument niya, ina-atake mo, yung mismong tao na ina-atake mo. And then next is argumentum ad baculum, which appeals to the use of force or threats. So, parang applicable dito yung power tripping kasi for example, kunwari, nag-argue kayo ng parent mo, ganyan, tapos yung rebut niya sa'yo is parang, ay, kapag hindi ka nakinig sa akin, hindi na kita pag-aaralin, ganun. So, that is a fallacy kasi, diba, parang the parent is using force. Pinipilit ka niya na sumang-ayon dun sa side niya. And at the same time na, yun nga, pinagbabantaan ka niya na hindi ka na niya papag-aralin. So, parang ikaw na estudyante lang, ganun, na parang bata lang, ganun. Ano bang laban mo sa ganun, diba? Pero, yun, fallacy yun. And then next is argumentum ad misericordiam. This argument appeals to pity. Like, sadyang nagpapaawa yung kausap mo para lang umagree ka or yun nga, lumipat sa side niya, mag-agree sa side niya. So, ayun. Argumentum ad ignorantiam naman is from the term itself, argument that appeals to ignorance. So, ito yung dahil lang hindi disprove yung isang bagay, agad na siya kino-consider na totoo. Like, kunwari, si God, ganyan. Example lang to, no offense to, like, Catholics, ganyan. So, ayun, kunwari nga si God. Wala pa namang nakakapag-disprove talaga na, hindi nga siya totoo, ganun. Like, wala pang may solid evidence na, hindi nga siya totoo, ganun. So, dahil na hindi siya disproved, yung taong nag-argue, yung iniisip niya niyan is, okay, totoo si God. Kasi, yun nga, walang proof na hindi siya totoo. So, ayun, that is argumentum ad ignorantiam. And then, next is argumentum ad populum, which is from the term itself din, diba? Populum. It appeals to, or it follows, popularity, or yung mga traditions na hinuhold the whole time, ganun. So, example nito is, may kausap ka about abortion, ganyan. Tapos sabi niya, pro-life daw siya, ganun. Tapos, yung reason niya, pro-life daw siya, dahil sa long-held belief na bawal pumatay. Kasi sabi ng Bible na bawal pumatay. So, parang, ang nasa isip niya niyan, kapag sumang-ayon siya sa abortion, parang makakat yung long-held na belief niya, gano'n, yung tradition, makakat yung tradition na pinaniniwalaan niya yung, na bawal pumatay, gano'n. So, parang kunwari, last year and the following years, gano'n, pinaniniwalaan niya yun. Pero, ngayon na sumang-ayon na siya sa abortion, inisip niya na parang, ay, di ibig sabihin, hindi na ako naniniwala na bawal pumatay. Parang gano'n. So, ayun, it follows yung popularity, kung ano yung iniisip ng, or like, consensus ng maraming tao, yun yung parang basis niya, hindi siya solid evidence. Like, nakasunod lang siya sa opinion ng maraming tao, and nakasunod siya sa major traditions, ganun. Argumentum ad vericondiam naman is when the person appeals to the wrong authority. So, for example, may nagsabi na, ay, wag mo inumin yung gamot na yan, masama raw yan, sabi ng tito ko. So, ayun, valid sana yung argument niya if yung authority na sinabi niya is a medical professional. So, take note na it's okay to argue na mag-appeal ka to authority, but make sure na they're the right ones. as example kanina, ano ba qualifications ng tito niya, 'di ba? Para masabi nating credible and reliable yung sinasabi ng info na hindi dapat inumin yung gamot na yun. So, ayun. So, kung walang qualifications, ganun, like, hindi naman, kumbaga, well-versed or maalam sa mga medical stuff yung authority na sinabi nung nag-argue, then, hindi siya counted. It's invalid. It's a fallacy. And then, ayan, itong next 3 fallacies actually, sama-sama siyang ginamit sa module. So, starting with the Sharmaine fallacy, ito yung argument na ginagawang OA, ganun. Like, ina-exaggerate. Tapos, yung OA version na yun yung ina-attack. So, parang, naiiba na yung focus, ganun. Naiiba na siya from the main argument. And in connection with that, doon na pumapasok yung red herring fallacy naman, which does exactly that, na nililihis ka niya dun sa main argument, dinidistract ka, niredirect ka away from the main argument. So, ayun, fallacy yun. Tapos, false analogy is when the argument claims na parehas yung dalawang bagay dahil lang meron silang iisang similarity. So, example, yung hangin, di natin nakita pero totoo siya. So, I can say na yung mga diwata rin, totoo sila. So, that is a fallacy kasi, oo, parehas silang hindi natin nakikita. Yun yung one thing in common nila. Pero yung hangin, tsaka yung diwata, parang wala naman silang connect talaga sa isa't isa. Parang magkaibang usapan na yung mga yun. So, ayun, that's a fallacy. And then, yung slippery slope fallacy is when an argument claims that one thing will lead to a much worse event. So, for example, sinabi, pag di ka kumain ngayon, magkaka-ulcer ka, ganun. So, o diba, OA, di naman yun agad yung mangyayari kasi kung hindi ka kumain ngayon, siguro, sasakit mo na yung tiyan mo, ganun. Pero hindi naman ganun kalala yung sakit agad na makukuha mo, diba? So, ayun, that's a fallacy. Ayan, so, last 4, the fallacy of complex question. So, this argument presupposes an answer to another question. So, for example, out of nowhere, tinanong mo sa kausap mo, busog ka na ba? So, that's the fallacy of complex question kasi yung answer niya to a different question, which may be, kumain ka na ba? In-assume mo na yung answer niya dun is yes. Kaya nag-jump ka kaagad to a different question and tinanong mo kaagad kung busog na ba siya. Hindi mo pa nga tinatanong kung kumain na ba siya. So, ayun. Kasi pre-suppose mo na yung answer niya na yes, kaya naging ganun yung result. Pero, hindi dapat ganun because it's a fallacy. And then next is petitio principii or fallacy of begging the question. So, this is when you use your conclusion as the premise or reason ng argument mo. And vice versa. So, this is called circular reasoning na ayun nga, yung conclusion mo, yun yung ginagawa mong premise mo, tapos yung premise mo, yun din yung conclusion. So, parang walang nararating, like circular lang yung reasoning mo. Like, hindi siya clear talaga kung ano yung message or gusto mong iparating. Next is the fallacy of false dilemma. This is when the argument provides options as if yun lang yung pwede and wala na ibang choice. So, hindi niya kina-consider yung iba pang pwedeng possibility. And then lastly, if there is one thing all these fallacies have in common, it's that walang sense or maayos na reasoning yung mga conclusion. So this is called non sequitur, meaning it does not follow. Kasi yung premise does not follow the conclusion. Walang connect. So if may ka-debate ka tapos alam mo may nasabi siyang fallacy, pero hindi mo maalala like which one specifically yun, you can just claim it to be non sequitur and valid siya. Moving on to Module 6, the theory of appraisal. So in this module, we will be talking about how to identify the strength of an argument. Sa teleological, mas pinapansin niya yung consequences ng isang action. So, considered na tama yung isang action kapag yung consequence niya is something na like desirable or positive ganun. Parang mag-benefit ka from it, ganun. So, sinasabi na if may something na hahadlang sa good action na yun, then yung action na yun na humahadlang would then be considered na masama. So example is definition, the development of human potentials is good. Premise, man has an obligation to develop his human potentials. Conclusion, therefore, any action that promotes the development of human potentials is right, and any action that impedes the development is wrong. So, meron tayong mga tinatawag na premise and conclusion indicators. So, nandyan sila to emphasize and to help us spot premises and conclusions easier. So, ayan sila na naka-flash sa screen. So, moving on to inductive arguments, I think familiar na lahat dito. So, di ba kasi kapag sinabi mong deductive reasoning, yun yung may general na idea, tapos from there, inaalam mo yung mga specifics or yung details, ganun. And then, kapag sinabi mo naman na inductive reasoning, yun yung opposite, like, from the specifics or the details nga, dun mo parang nabubuo yung isang general na idea. So, from there, ganun din yung inductive arguments na yung mga specifics or in this case, yung mga premise, they build up the conclusion. So, for example, premise 1, Maria is a UP freshman and stays in a dormitory. Premise 2, Annalyn is also UP freshman and stays in a dormitory. Premise 3, Susan is also a UP freshman and stays in a dormitory. Premise 4, all UP freshmen that I am acquainted with stay in a dormitory and there is no conflicting case. So, the conclusion is, therefore, most UP freshmen stay in a dormitory. Pero, wait, yung conclusion natin parang hindi pa siya ganun ka-accurate, diba? Or katibay. So, kasi, yung premise kasi ng author is, ilan lang naman yung na-encounter niya na naka-dorm. Tapos, agad na siya nag-conclude na most UP freshmen daw is naka-dorm. So, take note na when you use a most claim or yung claim na gumagamit nga ng salitang most, gaya nung nasa sample, you should have evidence na 50% plus 1 ng population ng freshmen is nagdo-dorm. And since wala naman tayong access sa records kung ilan nga ba yung nakadorm, we can change the word most to many since a many claim requires less. So magiging, therefore, many UP freshmen stay in a dormitory. So another way para mas strengthen pa yung arguments natin is, of course, through adding more evidence. So, with all the premise na nandiyan sa screen, dadagdagan pa natin yan. So, premise 1, most UP freshmen stay in a dormitory. Premise 2, Bella is a UP freshman currently enrolled in Philo 1. Premise 3, 85% of Philo 1 students stay in a dormitory. Therefore, more likely than not, Bella stays in a dormitory. So, ano yung nagpatibay lalo dun sa premises natin? So, yun yung statistical generalization, which is yung 85% na na-mention kanina. So, dahil napatibay na natin yung evidence sa premises natin, naturally, napatibay na rin natin yung claim natin sa conclusion. So, ayun. But, take note na there's still a possibility na yung conclusion natin is mali siya. Kasi, what if si Bella pala is kasama siya ron sa 15% na hindi naman naka-dorm, diba? So, if you want to challenge an empirical argument, just prove that the required level of generalization asserted has not been met. Like, yung unang sample natin dyan sa screen, kung gusto mo siya i-challenge, just prove na mali siya kasi wala naman siya ng 50% plus 1. And remember that empirical statements do not follow the principle of excluded middle. So the statements can either be true, false, or just probable. Next is analytical argument. Yung major premise niya is an analytic statement, so sinusundan niya yung principle of excluded middle, meaning it can only be either true or false. So the premise is an empirical statement that is usually an instantiation, meaning a representation ng something na abstract of the given definition. So for example, definition, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Premise, David is unmarried. So the conclusion will be, therefore, David is a bachelor. So, sa evaluative arguments naman, it claims na something is good or bad, right or wrong, ganun. Parang more on sa mga choices siya, ganun. And this is actually the most neglected argument ng logicians kasi the main premise is usually a maxim, moral rule, or principle. But in contrary, ito naman yung commonly used for us na mga kumbaga ordinary citizens lang ganun. Yung mga hindi naman logician ganun. So, nagagamit natin siya kapag justify natin yung mga actions natin. It is already an evaluative argument. So, for example, yung pag-justify natin sa mga gastos natin, ganun. It is evaluative. So, identifying the strength of this argument is harder kasi nag-rely siya sa public acceptance or the intersubjective consensus ng mga tao. Which is, mahirap naman ma-estimate kasi iba-iba tayo, ganun. So, gaya ng example ko kanina, yung paggastos mo can either be judged to be good or bad. There are actually two types of evaluative arguments, deontological and teleological. So, starting with deontological, yung conclusion niya is a prescription, meaning pinaprohibit niya yung isang bagay. So, yung strength ng argument na to is dependent din sa public acceptance. So, kung accepted siya, then it is safe to say na tama yung premises and thus yung conclusion din. So, for example, moral principle, never punish an innocent person. Premise, Pedro is accused of a crime but he is innocent. Conclusion, therefore, Pedro should not be punished. Another example, premise, Maria and Anna were both caught cheating in their Philo 1 exam. Premise, Maria received a grade of 5.0. Conclusion, therefore, Anna should receive a grade of 5.02. So, kung mapapansin nyo, yung conclusion, sabi, should receive, di ba? Eh, akala ko ba dapat prescriptive yung conclusion natin? Well, since parang morals yung usapan, ganun, may concealed principle of fairness. So, obviously, parang it would be logical na isipin na, ay, hindi naman fair kung si Anna pasado pa rin siya tapos si Maria hindi, di ba? Lalo na parehas naman sila ng ginawa. So, ayun. Kaya ganun yung conclusion niya. Now that we know the types of arguments, how do we judge its strengths? First step is to identify the type of argument. Kapag empirical siya, you should check if the conclusion is a generalization and if the evidence seen in the premises confirm this. Kapag analytic, check if the terms used in the premises and conclusion are synchronized or in agreement. Then decide if the conclusion is an instantiation of an analytic definition. Kapag evaluative naman, check if the moral rule or principle in the conclusion has a strong public acceptance. So once na-establish mo na alin doon, step 2 is to temporarily grant all premises to be true. And gayon na lahat sila tama, check mo if the premises would support the conclusion, and if it does, check anong klaseng support. Is it strong, moderately strong, or only little support? Tapos, to challenge this, hanapin mo yung evidence na nagpapatunay na totoo yung conclusion and then show that the premises for it is not sufficient. Then, challenge the truth value of the premises and the conclusion. So, para sa premises, pakita mo na at least one of them is false. Pero if hindi kaya, pakita mo na yung truth value ng premises is medyo alanganin. So, kung ganon, gaya ng example kanina, you can say na di na naabot yung required evidence na 50% plus 1. Then, kapag mali yung isang premise, dami na yung buong premise set and naturally, pati na rin yung conclusion. So, to challenge the conclusion naman, basically, yung tatry mo lang gawin is i-prove mong mali siya by giving a counter-argument or a counter-example. So, this technique is very effective and it is an easy way to demolish an argument. So, that's all for me. I hope you're still here and listening. I'm now passing the floor to my partner, Angelo, for the discussion of Module 7.
Now let us move on to the 7th module titled Composing Complex Arguments. Now, if there's anything that philosophy teaches us that is how to argue. In this module, you will learn how to argue while also making sense in your argument. So, composing a complex argument, then criticizing its strength as a preparation for composing a counter argument are examples of the finest creative acts in philosophy, not unlike composing a poem or a musical score. So, in composing a complex argument, there are 6 main steps, and we will be discussing all of them in great detail. So, let's begin. For our first step, it is to examine the statement of the conclusion. So, there are actually 3 sub-steps for this particular step. The first one being to state your conclusion in simple language. So, pay attention to the types of concepts in your conclusion. This will set the momentum for the rest of the items in this template. If the key concept in your conclusion involves evaluative concepts, then more likely than not, the claim of your conclusion is evaluative. If the key concepts are analytic, then analytic claims. And if the key concepts are empirical, then the claim is empirical. So let us use the conclusion or the statement, most politicians are corrupt, as our conclusion. So, the statement of the conclusion is simple enough and uncomplicated. The claim most in the conclusion is not a vague empirical generalization. We have a fixed meaning of the 50% for the required evidence for any most claim. The term politicians is empirical, but the term corrupt may have an empirical use. It is also an evaluative term that is emotionally loaded. The term corrupt has a dual meaning, empirical as well as evaluative. Thus, conclusion is an empirical generalization with an emotionally loaded term. So the next sub-step that we are going to do is to define the key terms in your conclusion using the technique of analytic definition. So pay close attention to what can be taken as vague or ambiguous terms. Remember, if there are vague or ambiguous terms left undefined in your conclusion, it would be very difficult to determine the required evidence to prove the claim of your conclusion. So for example, going back to our conclusion, most politicians are corrupt. So the term politician in the context of the Philippine politics is vague as well as ambiguous. The term corrupt is best used in a legal context in order to avoid the derogatory connotation. And the coverage of the term most will be difficult to pin down if you don't know how politicians or how many politicians are there in the Philippines. And the last sub-step for the first step is you have to ask yourself, can there be agreement in the meaning of the terms? Or the very definition of the term is biased, hence is it controversial? So if an agreement could not be settled in the meaning of the key terms in your conclusion, then the argumentation will become verbal. Candidates for such controversy are politicians and corrupt. Now let us move on to the second step, which is analysis of the claim of the conclusion. So in this step, we actually have 2 sub-steps now. First is you have to classify the conclusion into types of knowledge claims. So generally, the type of knowledge claims found in your conclusion can be divided into analytic, empirical, or evaluative claims. Now let us move on to the second sub-step for our second step. Now you have to ask yourself, what is the conclusion trying to prove? What is the required proof or evidence in order to justify the claim of the conclusion? If you cannot answer these questions, you cannot compose the argument. This is the most critical step in composing a complex argument. The conclusion is making an empirical generalization with the most claim. What is the required evidence for the conclusion? To determine the required evidence, you have to ascertain the level of most claim, which is 50% plus 1 of the population of politicians. Unfortunately, the exact number of politicians in Philippine politics is not readily available. That is why the evidence needed to support the claim is difficult to ascertain. Now, you had to remember these 4 things during this step. If the conclusion is based on observations or facts about the real world, or in short, making an empirical generalization, the strength of the argument depends on the level of generalization. Providing evidence that matches the level of generalization is important. Next, if the conclusion involves judgments or opinions, or in short, evaluative claims, it gains strength through widespread agreement or public approval. Next, if the conclusion suggests a law or policy change or legal or policy proposal, its strength can be measured by positive outcomes if implemented, or the negative consequences if not. Lastly, determine if the claim is about things we can know or provable, or if it's inherently unknowable, or if it is not provable. Consider whether evidence can be produced in fact or just in theory. In simpler terms, it's about tailoring your argument to the type of statement you're making, whether it's based on evidence, public agreement, practical benefits, or the nature of the claim itself. Now that we've done those first 2 steps, it is now time to compose the argument. So, let's go back to our example a while ago, which is most politicians are corrupt. Now, you're prepared to offer at least 3, but no more than 5 premises that would provide the strongest support to the claim of your conclusion. Remember, composing arguments is one of the finest creative acts in philosophy. So, here are some of the examples of the premises that you can make based on our example, that is most politicians are corrupt. So I'm just gonna read you one. So the first one is, politicians are obsessed with one objective in mind: to win an election and stay in power. All obstacles to this goal must be eliminated either by legal or illegal means. So these premises, they will all be important later. So you have to create premises that are strongly supported. You have to create claims that are strongly supported by your supporting your conclusion. Okay, next, moving on to the 5th step, you have to compose the counter argument. So magtatagalog na lang ako. So kanina gumawa tayo ng argument natin sa step 3, di ba? Ngayon, para magkaroon tayo ng complex argument, because philosophy, we have to counter your argument. So after criticizing your own argument, you are now prepared to defend the opposite of your original conclusion. So kapag nakikipag-argue ka, you don't only look at your side. You also try to consider yung side ng ka-argue mo. That's why this is important kasi para mag-make sense yung sinasabi mo, and for you to make sure that your claims have basically sort of like there's no loopholes dun sa mga sinasabi mo. So, follow the steps from 1 to 3. Complete this by providing at least 3 but no more than 5 premises that would support the claim of the opposite conclusion. So yung gagawin dito basically is just the 3rd step, pero kabaligtaran lang. So imbis na supportahan mo yung conclusion mo, you have to counter it, like baligtarin mo. So here are the examples of the premise set that are included in the book. So yeah, that is what you have to do. Next sub-step is that, as I've said, you have to scrutinize your premises. So the premises that I showed you before during the third step, you have to scrutinize those as well. So the first sub-step, we scrutinize the conclusion all politicians are corrupt. During this step, we are going to scrutinize the premises that we have created that I've showed you a while ago. So this step is extremely long, so I'm just going to be simplifying. I will be explaining it in short terms and simple terms. So the argument is making an empirical generalizations about politicians with emotionally charged language. It also lacked the necessary evidence to support the claim that most politicians are corrupt. The argument is persuasive due to public perception, but it lacks empirical backing. One weakness of the premises is the absence of data on the percentage of politicians, because as I've said before, we don't know the amount or like the number of politicians in the Philippines. Like, we don't know if all of them are corrupt. So like, we don't know like how many politicians are there in the Philippines. So the absence of data on the percentage of politicians convicted of political election related crimes. This evidence would significantly strengthen the argument, so it is considered. While the argument may be widely believed, it falls short in terms of providing conclusive empirical support. The use of emotionally charged language and the reliance on public perception without solid evidence make the argument less robust. Lastly, to strengthen the argument, incorporating data on the conviction rate of politicians would be crucial. Without the additional premise, the argument remains persuasive but not conclusively proven. So ano nga ba yung ibig sabihin nito? Magtatagalog na ako para maging mas clear kasi sobrang haba ng part talaga na to. Kahit ako medyo naloko din ako nung binabasa ko to. So basically, sinasabi niya na, or basically, ang ginagawa niya is kinikriticize niya yung mga ginawa natin kanina na premises, yung apat sa step 3. Sinasabi niya dito yung mga weaknesses ng mga premise natin. So, for example, yung unang premise, yung unang weakness niya is wala tayong solid evidence kung ilan yung or kung ilan yung politicians dito sa Philippines. So, wala tayong consensus. Wala tayong data na makakapagbigay sa atin kung ilan talaga yung mga politicians sa Pilipinas. So, therefore, hindi natin alam if most politicians nga ba are corrupt. Second, parang sinabi niya dito na umaasa lang yung premises sa emotionally charged language and public perception. So, alam naman natin ngayon na kung ano yung nangyayari sa politics natin dito sa Pilipinas, right? And alam naman natin kung gaano kalala yung corruption na nangyayari sa Philippines. So, once na sinabi mo na, or kapag parang justify mo yung conclusion mo na most politicians are corrupt, parang sympathize ka sa nararamdaman ng public or ng audience mo, kumbaga, which are the Philippine people. So, ganun lang yung sinasabi nito, pero ang haba-haba na sinabi niya. Now that you have made your argument, it is now time to move on to the fourth step, which is criticizing your argument. So, remember that to create complex arguments, you have to know how to criticize your argument. So, there are two sub-steps during this step. It is first to scrutinize your conclusion and to scrutinize the premise set. So, let us first begin with the first sub-step, which is to scrutinize the conclusion. Now, let's go back again to our example. The conclusion most politicians are corrupt could not be seen as biased, and the terms politicians and corrupt may need clear definitions to ensure neutrality and acceptability. Next, upon examining the claim, the argument commits a fallacy of hasty generalization. Why is that? It is because the required evidence for the most claim in the conclusion was not produced in the premises. Next, if the conclusion were an evaluative claim, challenging it would involve determining evidence for a strong consensus, which, if not provided, would render the argument fallacious due to an irrelevant reason. And finally, for legal or policy proposals, it's crucial to scrutinize the estimated probability of both beneficial and aversive consequences to assess the strength of the argument. So, let us now move on to the sixth step in composing complex arguments. This is also the last step, and you have to evaluate both arguments. So, okay, so as a critical thinker, you have to ask yourself, so which of your argument is stronger, the original or the counter argument? So kaya tayo gumawa nung argument natin at ng counter argument natin para malaman natin kung tama ba yung pinagsasabi natin or kung nag-make sense ba tayo. So malalaman natin yan kapag in-evaluate natin kung ano nga ba yung mas nag-make sense, yung sa atin, yung original na ginawa natin, or yung ginawa natin ba't kabaligtaran. You have to ask yourself, which argument is more persuasive? And can you strengthen the weaker argument by adding, altering, and or modifying the premises? So, based on our example kanina, here is the simplified analysis na ginawa ko because yung nasa book sobrang hirap intindihin. So, English to, kasi English yung text. So, the original argument appears more persuasive due to its connection with the cultural context, asserting that public perception in the Philippine politics equates to reality. So, yun nga, kasi katulad ng sinabi ko sa inyo kanina, so, mas persuasive yung first argument natin, yung original argument natin, na most politicians are corrupt, kasi nga, it is, parang pinagdadaanan natin siya ngayon, na maraming corruption na nangyayari ngayon sa Philippines, and yung mga tao talaga dito sa Philippines are tired of this fucking corruption. And it equates to reality. However, okay, we're evaluating. So, however, both arguments lack empirical evidence for the generalization. So, most politicians are corrupt. To strengthen the weaker counter-argument, providing the percentage of politicians convicted of political election-related crimes would enhance or would improve the empirical support, making it more robust and competitive with the original argument. So, basically, kanina, ini-evaluate mo lang yung sarili mong claim. Yung like both naman sarili mong claim, but like yung original claim. But for this step, you have to evaluate the counter-argument as well. And you basically, ito lang siya. You have to weigh them down. Ano nga ba yung mas mabigat? Ano nga ba yung mas nagpa-pack ng punch? At ano nga ba yung mas nagme-make sense? That is all for this module. Thank you so much for watching. I hope na naituro ko siya ng maayos. And if you want to use our handout, you can. The handout is basically all the information in the handout was just lifted off of the book ni Acuña, yung philosophical analysis, because we thought that just in case gusto ni Sir Kalika na gumawa ng questions based dun sa book, magagamit nyo pa rin yung handout namin because yung napansin namin last long exam, hindi masyadong nagamit yung handout because iba yung information na nakalagay dun sa handout. Or like, hindi naman iba, but like, it's written in a different way. Kumbaga, it's written in a different way, so medyo nakakalito siya. So, but this time, gumawa kami na handout na galing mismo sa book, yung information, yung text, para kung sakaling doon kumuha si Sir Kalika ng questions for our long exam, yun na yun pa rin yung i-review nyo. So basically, sinummarize lang namin ni Sharmaine. Thank you so much for watching.